They say money can't buy love, but what happens when a billionaire loses everything trying to prove that wrong? I'm the woman who walked away from billions, and today, I'm sharing how my rejection changed both our lives forever. This is my story, and it's not what you think. Before we dive into this wild journey, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell because stories like this don't come around often. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single detail of what happened next. Hi, I'm Maya. I'm 28 years old, and I'm a graphic designer living in the heart of Atlanta. Now, before you start thinking this is some rags to riches fairy tale, let me stop you right there. This is the complete opposite. This is the story of how I walked away from more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes, and I'd do it again without hesitation. I grew up in a middle-class family where love was measured in Sunday dinners around the kitchen table, not dollar signs in a bank account. My mama worked as a school teacher, and my daddy fixed cars for a living. They taught me something that I carry with me to this day. Your worth isn't determined by what's in your wallet, but by what's in your heart. We weren't rich, but we were rich in the things that actually mattered. Family barbecues, game nights, helping neighbors when they needed it most. I've never been the type of girl who got excited about designer handbags or expensive jewelry. Give me a good book, a cup of coffee, and my sketch pad, and I'm perfectly content. I measure success by the impact of my work, the relationships I build, and whether I can look at myself in the mirror each morning, knowing I stayed true to who I am. Money was just something that paid the bills and let me buy art supplies. Nothing more, nothing less. It was a Tuesday night in October, and I was camped out at my favorite coffee shop downtown, working on a logo design for a local nonprofit. You know those nights when you're so deep in your creative zone that the world just disappears around you? That was me, completely absorbed in my laptop screen, surrounded by crumpled napkins with rough sketches, and an empty coffee cup that I'd forgotten to refill hours ago. That's when he walked in, tall, with kind eyes, and this gentle smile that seemed genuine in a world full of fake pleasantries. He was wearing a simple grey sweater and jeans, nothing fancy, nothing that screamed for attention. Just a regular guy who looked like he might work at the bookstore down the street or teach at the local college. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and when he turned around, our eyes met for just a second. Most guys in coffee shops either ignore you completely or try way too hard to get your attention. But Adrian, that's what he told me his name was, he just smiled and asked if the chair across from me was taken. "I don't want to disturb your work," he said, "but this place is packed, and you look like you might appreciate some quiet company." There was something about the way he said it, respectful but warm, that made me gesture to the empty seat. We started talking, and it wasn't the usual small talk you get from strangers. He noticed my sketches and asked about my work with genuine curiosity. We talked about art, about the way creativity can change people's lives, about dreams and the courage it takes to chase them. Hours passed like minutes, and when I finally looked up, the coffee shop was closing around us. When he asked for my number that night, I didn't hesitate. There was something refreshing about him, something real that I hadn't felt in the dating world for a long time. He didn't try to impress me with stories about his job or his car or his apartment. He just wanted to know if I'd like to get coffee again sometime, maybe see a local art exhibit he'd heard about. Our first official date was perfect in its simplicity. We went to a small gallery in the arts district, spent hours wandering through exhibits and sharing what we saw in each piece. He had this way of looking at art that was completely his own, not trying to sound smart or cultured, just honest reactions that made me see things differently. Afterward, we grabbed burgers from a food truck and sat in the park, talking until the stars came out. Date after date, it was more of the same beautiful simplicity. We'd explore used bookstores and debate our favorite authors. We'd go to free concerts in the park and discover new musicians together. He'd bring me coffee when I was working late, and I'd sketch little drawings on napkins that made him laugh. Never once did he mention money, success, or anything that felt like he was trying to impress me with material things. I started falling for him in a way that felt completely natural and unforced. This wasn't some whirlwind romance built on expensive dinners and fancy gifts. This was two people genuinely enjoying each other's company, sharing thoughts and dreams and quiet moments that felt more valuable than anything money could buy. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in a relationship where I could just be myself, completely and authentically, without any pretense or performance. 3 months into what I thought was the most honest relationship of my life, everything changed with a single magazine cover. I was sitting in my dentist's waiting room, mindlessly flipping through an old copy of Forbes, when I saw a face that made my heart stop. There he was, my sweet, simple Adrian, staring back at me from the cover with the headline, Tech Titan Adrian Chen, How He Built a $4.2 billion Empire Before 35. I read that article 3 times, my hands shaking with each word. Private jets, multiple mansions, a company that employed thousands of people. The man I'd been falling in love with, the one who split food truck burgers with me and wore the same grey sweater to half our dates, was one of the wealthiest people in the country. Every simple moment we'd shared suddenly felt like a lie, every humble conversation like an elaborate performance. That evening, when he showed up at my apartment with takeout from our favorite Thai place, I confronted him with the magazine still clutched in my hands. "Who are you really?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. The guilt, the fear, the desperate hope that maybe this wouldn't change everything between us. But it already had. Adrian sat down on my couch, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked small. He told me about growing up wealthy but lonely, about parents who showed love through trust funds instead of time. He explained how every relationship he'd ever had was tainted by his money. Women who saw dollar signs instead of the person he was inside. "Maya," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "do you know what it's like to never know if someone loves you or loves what you can give them? When I met you for the first time in my adult life, someone looked at me and saw just me. Not my bank account, not my company, not what I could buy them. Just Adrian." He reached for my hands, but I pulled them away. He told me about all the times he'd almost revealed the truth, how he'd practiced the conversation in his head 100 different ways. He was scared, he said, terrified that the moment I knew who he really was, everything genuine between us would disappear. "I was going to tell you," he promised. "I just wanted a little more time being normal, being loved for who I am instead of what I have." I understood his reasoning, I really did. But understanding didn't erase the fact that our entire relationship had been built on a fundamental lie. Every time I'd paid for my own coffee, every time we'd split a dinner bill, every time I'd chosen our activities based on my budget, while he could have afforded anything in the world, it all felt like a cruel joke where I was the only one not in on the punchline. After that night, everything changed, and not in the way either of us hoped. Adrian seemed to think that now that his secret was out, he could finally show me his world. The next morning, a delivery arrived at my apartment, a designer dress worth more than my monthly rent, with a note asking me to dinner at the city's most exclusive restaurant. I called him immediately. "Adrian, this isn't who I am," I tried to explain. "I don't want expensive things. I fell in love with the guy who shared food truck meals with me, not someone who thinks love can be upgraded with a price tag." But he insisted he was just trying to share his life with me, to include me in his world, the way I'd included him in mine. The gifts kept coming. Art supplies that cost more than my car, jewelry that belonged in museums, invitations to galas, and charity events where I felt like a fraud in borrowed finery. His friends and family welcomed me with the kind of enthusiasm that felt more like they were celebrating his acquisition of a new toy rather than meeting someone he cared about. Worst of all, I could feel myself disappearing. The Maya who sketched on napkins and got excited about finding a good book at a thrift store was being slowly replaced by someone who had to think about photographers and social expectations and whether my clothes were appropriate for a billionaire's girlfriend. I was losing myself in his world, and he couldn't see that his attempt to elevate me was actually destroying everything he claimed to love about me. What started as expensive gifts quickly escalated into something that made my skin crawl. Adrian began buying entire companies just to impress me. When I mentioned loving a small independent bookstore during one of our conversations, he purchased it the next week and renamed it Maya's Corner. When I donated $50 to a local animal shelter, he wrote them a check for $2 million and put my name on a plaque. It wasn't generosity anymore. It was obsession disguised as love. He bought the building where my favorite coffee shop was located, just so they could never close or change. He hired famous artists to create pieces inspired by my beauty and hung them in galleries across the city. Every cause I'd ever mentioned caring about suddenly had the Chen Foundation as a major donor, and my name attached to press releases I'd never approved. The worst part was watching him lose himself in this desperate need to prove his love through his wallet. The thoughtful, genuine man I'd fallen for was disappearing, replaced by someone who thought every problem could be solved with money, every emotion could be bought, every relationship could be purchased. He started making business decisions based on what he thought would impress me rather than what made sense for his company. His friends and business partners began looking at me like I was some kind of expensive addiction that was ruining his judgment. And maybe they were right. But I wasn't the one encouraging this behavior. I was the one begging him to stop. The end came at a charity gala he'd insisted I attend. I was wearing a dress that cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by people who measured worth in stock portfolios and real estate investments. I felt like a fraud, a girl from Atlanta playing dress-up in a world where I'd never belong. That's when Adrian got down on one knee in front of 500 of the city's wealthiest elite. The ring he pulled out was obscene, a diamond so large it looked fake, surrounded by smaller stones that probably cost more than my parents' house. The entire ballroom fell silent, phones came out to record the moment, and camera flashes started going off like we were celebrities. "Maya," he said, his voice echoing through the microphone someone had handed him. "You've shown me what real love looks like. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life showing you how much you mean to me?" The room was waiting, hundreds of eyes on me, expecting me to say yes to what everyone there probably thought was the proposal of a lifetime. But all I could think about was how far we'd traveled from that quiet coffee shop where we'd first met. This wasn't love. This was a performance, a public declaration of ownership disguised as romance. I looked at him, this man I'd once loved, kneeling in his $1,000 suit with a ring worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, and I knew my answer. "No," I said quietly, but in that silent ballroom, it might as well have been a scream. The word hung in the air like a physical thing, and I watched Adrian's face crumble with confusion and disbelief. The room erupted in whispers and gasps, but all I could focus on was the hurt in his eyes. I helped him stand up, took his hands in mine one last time, and spoke the truth I should have said months earlier. "Adrian, I fell in love with a man who was content to share a burger from a food truck. I can't marry someone who thinks love is measured in carats and dollar signs. This isn't who you are, and it's definitely not who I am." The humiliation on his face was painful to witness, but I couldn't take back what needed to be said. I slipped off the designer bracelet he'd given me earlier that evening, placed it gently in his palm, and walked out of that ballroom in my expensive dress and uncomfortable shoes, knowing I was walking away from more money than I'd ever see again. But I was also walking back toward myself. 3 days later, I packed up everything he'd ever given me and had it delivered to his office with a note that said simply, "I loved you for who you were, not what you had. I hope someday you remember the difference." I changed my phone number, deleted my social media accounts, and disappeared from his world completely. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but also the most necessary. Some loves aren't meant to survive the real world, and ours was one of them. I thought walking away would be the end of our story, but I was wrong. In the month that followed, I watched from a distance as Adrian's life began to unravel in ways I never could have imagined. At first, I tried to avoid any news about him, but in a city like Atlanta, when a billionaire starts making headlines for all the wrong reasons, it's impossible to escape the story. It started with his business decisions. Friends who worked in the financial district began telling me about Adrian's increasingly erratic investments. He was pouring money into companies and causes that made no sense from a business perspective, but made perfect sense if you understood that he was still trying to win me back. He bought a struggling art therapy program and renamed it the Maya Initiative. He invested millions in a fair trade coffee company because he remembered how much I cared about ethical sourcing. Every investment seemed designed to prove something to me, even though I was no longer in his life to see it. His business partners started questioning his judgment, and according to the financial news, his company's stock began a steady decline. The man who had built an empire through careful calculation and strategic thinking was now making decisions with his heart instead of his head, and it was costing him everything. But the worst part wasn't the money he was losing. It was watching someone I'd once cared about destroy himself trying to recreate something that could never be bought or rebuilt. The thoughtful, genuine man I'd fallen in love with in that coffee shop was disappearing completely, replaced by someone obsessed with grand gestures and public demonstrations of love for a woman who was no longer there to receive them. The numbers were staggering when they finally made the news. In 18 months, Adrian had lost over $1.8 billion, not through market crashes or economic downturns, but through a series of increasingly desperate attempts to prove his love for someone who was no longer part of his life. He'd had to sell 3 of his homes, his art collection, and even his private jet. Mutual friends who still kept in touch with both of us told me things that broke my heart. Adrian had become a shell of himself, unable to focus on work, unable to maintain relationships, unable to move forward. He'd created a foundation in my name without my permission, spent millions on billboards around the city with messages meant for me, and even tried to buy the non-profit I was working for just so he could have a reason to see me again. The business world that had once celebrated him as a visionary now whispered about his downfall at cocktail parties and boardroom meetings. His reputation, built over decades of smart investments and innovative thinking, was crumbling under the weight of his obsession. The man who had once been featured on magazine covers as a success story was now being written about as a cautionary tale about what happens when money and heartbreak collide. But what hurt me most wasn't the money he'd lost or the empire he'd damaged. It was knowing that somewhere in all of this destruction was the man I'd loved, the one who used to talk about art and dreams in coffee shops. And he was disappearing more completely with each desperate attempt to win back something that had never really been about money in the first place. Looking back on everything that happened, I've learned some hard truths about love, money, and what really matters in life. The biggest lesson: money doesn't just fail to buy love, it can actually destroy it. When Adrian started trying to prove his feelings through his wallet, he stopped seeing me as a person and started treating me like a prize to be won. Real love isn't about what someone can give you or how much they're willing to spend on you. It's about those quiet moments of connection, the shared laughter over inside jokes, the comfort of being completely yourself with another person. The man I fell in love with understood that. The billionaire he became when his secret was revealed had forgotten it completely. I also learned that staying true to your values isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Walking away from more money than most people see in a lifetime was terrifying, but compromising who I was would have been worse. I would rather be broke and authentic than rich and living a lie. The hardest lesson was realizing that sometimes loving someone means accepting that you can't save them from themselves. Adrian's obsession wasn't really about me. It was about his own fears and insecurities around love and worth. No amount of staying or leaving could have fixed that for him. 3 years later, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I'm still a graphic designer, still living in my modest apartment, still finding joy in simple pleasures that money can't buy. I met someone new about a year ago, Kevin, a high school teacher who makes me laugh and shares my love for weekend farmers markets and old movies. He drives a 15-year-old Honda and has never once tried to impress me with anything other than his kindness and sense of humor. We split dinner bills, take turns buying coffee, and plan dates around free events in the city. It's everything my relationship with Adrian was in those first beautiful months, except this time there are no secrets, no hidden fortunes, no fear that money will come between us. Kevin knows my story, understands why trust is so important to me, and has never made me feel like I need to be anyone other than exactly who I am. As for Adrian, I hear he's slowly rebuilding his life and his business. He's dating someone new, another woman from his world who understands the complexities of wealth and public life. I genuinely hope he's happy and that he's learned to separate love from money. Part of me will always care about the man I met in that coffee shop, even though that version of him might be gone forever. I don't regret my choice, not for a single moment, because at the end of the day, I'd rather have love that's real than love that's bought, and I'd rather be poor and authentic than rich and pretending to be someone I'm not. Some things in life are truly priceless, and your integrity is one of them. So there you have it, my story of rejecting billions for something worth more than money. What would you have done in my situation? Let me know in the comments below. If this story touched you, smash that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about love and money. Until next time, remember, your worth isn't measured by someone else's wallet.